You! You don't belong here! Show me ID now!
Stand on my own property. I'm a retired police chief. Do you have a warrant?
Don't play smart with me. You think just because you're black and in a robe I won't take action? Hands where I can see you!
Identification, now! Don't make this worse!
At 6:40 a.m. on a quiet Wednesday morning in Crestwood, Georgia, dew still sat on the lawns of Maple Ridge Drive. The street was calm, lined with manicured hedges, two-car garages, and American flags hanging from porches that had never seen trouble. It was the kind of neighborhood where people waved from their driveways and left packages on doorsteps without worry. Predominantly white, upper middle class, and safe in every way the word was supposed to mean. Clarence Dupree, 62 years old, stepped out his front door in slippers and a terry cloth robe, coffee in one hand, heading for the newspaper at the end of the driveway. Through the front window behind him, a row of framed commendation plaques from the Ridgefield Police Department were visible on the wall, each one marking a chapter of a career that had spanned more than 3 decades. Clarence had started as a patrol officer at 25, walking beats in neighborhoods no one else wanted. He worked narcotics, led a tactical unit, made sergeant, then lieutenant, then captain. At 52, the city appointed him chief of police, the first black man to hold the position in Ridgefield's 140-year history. He served for 7 years, oversaw department reforms, reduced use of force complaints by 40%, and retired with full honors. The governor had sent a letter. His officers had lined the street the day he walked out for the last time. Now, 3 years into retirement, Clarence spent his mornings in the garden, walked his dog along the creek behind the house, and read the paper on the porch before his wife woke up. His neighbors respected him. They knew his name. They knew what he had given. He bent down and picked up the newspaper, tucked it under his arm, and turned back toward the porch. That was when 2 black Chevrolet Suburbans turned onto Maple Ridge Drive. They moved slowly, almost deliberately, the tinted windows catching the early light. They stopped in front of Clarence's house. 4 men stepped out. All wore tactical vests with the letters ICE printed across the chest. The lead agent was Victor Stelling, 44 years old, 16 years with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. Stelling had built his reputation on aggressive field operations, the kind that generated numbers for quarterly reports and complaints from immigration advocacy organizations in equal measure. His file contained 9 formal complaints over the past 6 years, ranging from unlawful entry to excessive force during detentions. None had resulted in discipline. He had learned, like so many before him, that the system would absorb the complaints and keep him on the street. His partner was Kyle Fenton, 31, 5 years on the job, a younger agent who had attached himself to Stelling early and never let go. Fenton mimicked Stelling's language, copied his approach, laughed at the same jokes, and never once questioned a decision in the field. 2 additional agents stayed near the vehicles, hands on their belts, scanning the quiet street like they had rolled into a threat zone. They were supposed to be looking for an undocumented immigrant connected to a residence 3 blocks east. The address didn't match. The name didn't match. Nothing about Clarence Dupree's home had any connection to their operation. But Stelling had spotted something from behind the windshield as they passed. A black man standing in the driveway of a house that, in his judgment, didn't seem to belong to someone who looked like that. He didn't check the file. He didn't confirm the address. He didn't radio dispatch. He just pulled over, stepped out, and started walking toward Clarence with the kind of certainty that only comes from years of never being held accountable. Fenton followed a step behind, right hand resting on his belt. Clarence looked up from his driveway, newspaper under one arm, coffee still warm in his hand, and saw 4 federal agents approaching his front lawn. His posture straightened, not out of fear, but out of recognition. After 34 years in law enforcement, he knew exactly what he was looking at. And he knew, with the instinct of a man who had spent his life on the other side of the badge, that what was about to happen had nothing to do with any warrant. Stelling closed the distance fast, stopping 3 feet from Clarence with the kind of proximity that wasn't professional. It was territorial. He looked Clarence up and down, eyes moving over the bathrobe, the slippers, the newspaper. "I need to see some identification." His voice wasn't a request. It was a command wrapped in the assumption that it would be obeyed without question. Clarence didn't flinch. He had heard that tone thousands of times across 34 years. had trained officers to never use it unless the situation demanded it. This situation didn't. He kept his hands visible, coffee still in one, newspaper tucked under the other arm. "Good morning. What's this about?" Stelling's jaw tightened. "I said I need identification. Now." Fenton moved to Clarence's right side, cutting off the path to the front door. His hand stayed near his belt. Clarence noted the positioning instinctively. A flank. He had taught that formation himself to patrol teams. 2 points of control on a single subject. Standard for a threat. Absurd for a man in slippers holding a newspaper. "I'm a retired law enforcement officer," Clarence said, his voice steady and clear. "Retired Chief of Police, Ridgefield PD. I've lived at this address for 11 years. Do you have a warrant?" Stelling didn't answer the question. He didn't acknowledge the career. He didn't ask for clarification. He looked at Clarence the way he had looked at dozens of people before him. People whose answers didn't matter because the decision had already been made. "Put your hands where I can see them. Both of them." Clarence lowered the newspaper slowly. "I'm standing on my own property in a bathrobe. I've identified myself verbally. I'm asking again, do you have a warrant for this address?" Stelling stepped closer. Close enough that Clarence could smell the coffee on his breath. "We'll determine whose property this is." Across the street, a curtain shifted. 2 houses down, a garage door that had been halfway open stopped moving. A woman in a second-floor window pressed her face closer to the glass. Maple Ridge Drive was waking up, and what it was waking up to was something it had never seen before. Clarence kept his voice calm. "My ID is inside the house. I'm happy to go get it." He turned slightly toward the front door. Stelling moved into his path, chest forward, blocking the walkway completely. "Nobody is going inside." Clarence stopped. He didn't step back, but he didn't push forward. He understood what was happening. He had seen it from the other side enough times to know. The moment an officer decides the subject isn't getting the benefit of the doubt, every option closes. You go for your ID, you're making a sudden move. You stand still, you're being uncooperative. You ask questions, you're being combative. There is no right answer, because the answer was never the point. "I am not resisting," Clarence said. His voice was louder now, not aggressive, but deliberate, projected. The voice of a man who knew that witnesses mattered. "I am a retired police chief. I am unarmed. I am on my own property." Stelling's mouth curved slightly. "Sure you are." He turned to Fenton. "Cuff him." Fenton moved immediately. His hand locked around Clarence's left wrist and pulled it behind his back. Clarence didn't resist. He kept his body loose, his feet planted. "Do you have a warrant for this address?" he asked again. No one answered. Stelling stepped forward and drove his palm into Clarence's upper back, shoving him against the side of his own truck parked in the driveway. The impact was hard enough to knock the air from his chest. His bathrobe tore at the shoulder seam. The coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the concrete, brown liquid spreading across the driveway in a slow, dark stain. Fenton wrenched both arms back and snapped the cuffs on, ratcheting them 2 clicks tighter than necessary. Clarence's cheek pressed against the cold metal of the truck bed. His breath fogged against the surface. From where his face rested, he could see his front porch. The American flag hung still in the windless morning. The commendation plaques were just visible through the window, and somewhere behind him, the 2 men who had put him in cuffs hadn't once looked at a warrant, checked an address, or confirmed a name, because none of that had ever been the point. The first door to open was Ruth Engelman's. She was 71 years old, a retired schoolteacher who had lived next door to Clarence for 20 years. She had watched him build the garden bed along the fence line. She had brought over pie the week he moved in, and had never stopped. She stepped onto her porch in a housecoat, one hand on the railing, and saw Clarence Dupree face down against the side of his own truck, hands cuffed behind his back, bathrobe torn, surrounded by men in tactical vests. Her voice carried across the yard like a bell. "That's Chief Dupree! What are you doing to him? He lives here!" Stelling didn't turn. Fenton glanced over his shoulder. "Ma'am, go back inside." "I will not go back inside. That man is my neighbor. He's a retired police chief. You have no business putting your hands on him." Across the street, a front door opened. Donald Pratt, 64, a white retired firefighter with 30 years on the job, stepped out with his phone already raised and recording. He didn't say a word at first. He just aimed the camera and started walking closer. "What are your badge numbers?" Donald asked. His voice was flat, direct, the tone of a man used to emergencies. Stelling turned now. "Sir, I need you to step back and go inside. This is a federal operation." Donald didn't move. "I asked for your badge numbers. You're detaining a man on his own property. I have a right to record this." Stelling's jaw clenched. "If you interfere with a federal operation, I will charge you with obstruction." "Try it," Donald said. "I'm standing on a public sidewalk. 2 houses down, a young couple, Liam and Sophia Garrett, appeared in their upstairs window, phone pressed against the glass, recording from an elevated angle that captured the full scene. The driveway, the SUVs, the agents, Clarence's torn robe, the shattered mug. Another neighbor opened a garage door. A woman on the corner stopped mid-jog and pulled out her phone. Fenton looked at the growing audience and leaned toward one of the backup agents near the vehicles. "Keep the civilians back." The agent stepped forward but stopped at the edge of the sidewalk, unsure of how far his authority reached on a residential street where no crime had been committed. Ruth hadn't moved. She stood on her porch, arms crossed, watching with the kind of fury that comes from witnessing something you know is wrong and refusing to look away. At least 5 phones were recording now. The entire cul-de-sac had become a witness. And not one of those cameras showed a warrant, a file, or a single legitimate reason for what was happening in Clarence Dupree's driveway. Stelling opened the rear door of the lead Suburban and guided Clarence inside with a hand on the back of his head. No explanation was given, no Miranda rights were read, no paperwork was shown. Clarence sat in silence, hands cuffed behind him, the torn bathrobe hanging open, slippers still on his feet. The seat smelled like disinfectant and sweat. The partition between the back and front was solid, no handle on the inside. He had sat on the other side of that partition for decades. He knew exactly what it meant to be behind it. The SUV pulled away from Maple Ridge Drive while Ruth still stood on her porch and Donald still held his phone in the air. Fenton rode in the passenger seat. Stelling drove. Neither spoke to Clarence. Neither acknowledged that the man in the back had told them 4 times who he was, had asked 3 times for a warrant, and had not once raised his voice or moved his hands. The drive took 40 minutes. The regional ICE processing facility was a gray concrete building behind a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. Clarence was walked through a side entrance, past a metal detector, into a fluorescent-lit processing area where he was photographed against a white wall, fingerprinted on a digital scanner, and handed a clear plastic bag for his personal belongings. He had nothing to put in it. He had been taken from his driveway before he could grab his wallet, his phone, or his dignity. He was placed in a holding room with a metal bench bolted to the wall and a camera in the ceiling corner. The door locked behind him. When the intake officer ran his information and Clarence again stated clearly that he was a United States citizen and a retired chief of police, the officer paused. He looked at the screen, then at Clarence, then back at the screen. Something in his expression shifted. He stepped out of the room. Stelling was waiting in the corridor. The intake officer said something Clarence couldn't hear. Stelling's response carried through the door. "Process him like anyone else. We'll sort it out." Clarence sat on the metal bench, back straight, wrists raw from the cuffs that had only just been removed. He asked for a phone call. He was told it would be arranged. 2 hours passed before anyone came back. 2 hours in a locked room in slippers and a torn robe, with no charges, no explanation, and no record of why he was there. When the phone was finally placed in front of him, Clarence dialed the one number he knew would turn a local mistake into a federal reckoning. Clarence dialed his son's number from memory. Nathaniel Dupree, 36, was an Army JAG attorney stationed at Fort Liberty. He had spent the last decade in military law, handling cases that required precision, patience, and an understanding of how systems worked and how they failed. When his phone rang at 9:14 a.m. and he heard his father's voice, steady but stripped of its usual warmth, the patience disappeared. Nathaniel listened for 90 seconds. Then he hung up and went to work. His first call was to the ICE Regional Field Office. He identified himself as Captain Nathaniel Dupree, U.S. Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, and demanded his father's immediate release. He was told the matter was under review. "Under review," Nathaniel repeated. "You detained a 62-year-old U.S. citizen with no warrant at an address that isn't connected to any active operation. What exactly is under review?" The line went to hold. Nathaniel didn't wait. His next call went to the Ridgefield Police Department, where his father had served for 34 years. Officers who had worked under Clarence still walked those halls. The name Dupree still carried weight there. Word moved fast. Within the hour, Yvonne Saunders, Clarence's former deputy chief and now acting chief of the department, picked up her phone and called ICE directly. She confirmed Clarence's full name, date of birth, citizenship, address, rank, and career history. She was told they were verifying the information. Saunders' voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. "You arrested a 34-year law enforcement veteran in his bathrobe in his own driveway with no warrant. What exactly are you verifying?" There was silence on the other end. Saunders continued, "I'm going to give you my direct number, and then I'm going to call the Department of Justice. You have 1 hour to make this right before it stops being a phone call and becomes a federal incident." Donald Pratt uploaded the video at 8:47 a.m. He didn't add a caption. He didn't need to. The footage spoke in a language that needed no explanation. It showed the full arrest from the sidewalk, Stelling's aggressive approach, Clarence's calm compliance, the demand for identification, the refusal to answer questions about a warrant, the shove against the truck, the torn bathrobe, the coffee mug shattering on the concrete. Ruth Engelman's voice cutting across the yard. "That's Chief Dupree! What are you doing to him?" By noon, the video had 200,000 views. By evening, it had crossed 2 million. Local news stations ran it first, then national outlets picked it up. The headline wrote itself, and every network ran some version of the same words. ICE agents arrest retired black police chief in his own driveway. No warrant, no cause. The comments came in waves. Veterans groups issued statements. Police associations called it a disgrace to the badge. Civil rights organizations demanded an investigation. Retired officers from departments across the country shared the video with one line: "That could have been any of us." The Garrett couple's footage from the upstairs window added a second angle, wider, showing the full cul-de-sac, the SUVs, the backup agents standing uselessly by the vehicles, while a 62-year-old man in slippers was cuffed on his own property. That footage was reposted by accounts with millions of followers. The optics were devastating, and they were undeniable. A decorated black law enforcement leader who had spent his life protecting his community, treated like a fugitive in front of his neighbors, on a lawn he had mowed for 11 years, beneath a flag he had earned the right to fly, and every second of it had been captured by the people who knew him best. By midday, the video had reached the desks that mattered. ICE leadership in Washington was briefed. The regional field office director pulled the operational file for Stelling's unit and within minutes confirmed what Clarence had said from the beginning. There was no warrant for his address. There had never been one. The target of the operation was a residence 3 blocks east on a different street with a different house number. Stelling had never verified the address before stepping out of the vehicle. He had never cross-referenced the file. He had never contacted dispatch. He had seen a black man in a nice neighborhood and made a decision that bypassed every protocol his training was supposed to enforce. An internal review of Stelling's record surfaced a memo that should have ended the conversation years ago. He had been flagged twice before, once for conducting an enforcement operation at an incorrect address in Gwinnett County, where agents entered the wrong home and detained a legal resident for 4 hours. Once for excessive force during a routine detention in Cobb County, where a complaint described Stelling shoving a handcuffed man into the side of a vehicle hard enough to crack a rib. Both complaints had been filed. Both had been reviewed. Both had been closed with no discipline, no retraining, no consequence. The system had looked at Victor Stelling twice and decided he was not a problem. Now the system was watching a video with 6 million views that proved otherwise. The regional director ordered Clarence's immediate release. No formal charges had ever been filed. No probable cause had ever existed. Clarence was driven back to Crestwood in the same SUV that had taken him. The ride was silent. No apology was offered. When the vehicle turned onto Maple Ridge Drive nearly 7 hours after he had been taken from it, the street looked nothing like it had that morning. News vans lined the curb. Cameras were already rolling. Clarence stepped out of the SUV in the same torn bathrobe and slippers he had been wearing when they took him. The cameras caught everything. The raw marks on his wrists, the stiffness in his shoulders, the way he paused for a moment on his own driveway and looked at the spot where his coffee mug had shattered that morning, the stain still visible on the concrete. Ruth Engelman reached him first. She crossed the lawn without a word and wrapped her arms around him. She held on for a long time. Donald Pratt was next. He extended his hand and Clarence took it. Donald nodded once. The look between them said more than any statement could. A reporter stepped forward. "Chief Dupree, do you have anything to say?" Clarence looked at the camera. His voice was steady, but thinner than it had been that morning, worn down by 7 hours of concrete walls and fluorescent lights, and silence. "I gave 34 years to law enforcement. I believed in the badge. I dedicated my life to what it was supposed to stand for. Today, that badge was used against me because of the color of my skin, on my own property, in front of my neighbors, without a warrant or a reason." He paused. "That's not law enforcement. That's something else." Inside the house, his wife Evelyn Dupree, 60, a retired school principal, sat at the kitchen table with her hands trembling around a glass of water she hadn't touched. She had watched the arrest from the bedroom window that morning. She had seen the agents grab him, shove him, cuff him against his own truck. She had wanted to run outside, but she was terrified that if she did, if she moved too fast or spoke too loud, they would put their hands on her too. Or worse, they would use her presence as an excuse to escalate. So she stood behind the glass and watched them take her husband. When Clarence sat down beside her, she looked at him with eyes that hadn't stopped crying for hours. "I watched them take you, and I couldn't breathe. I kept thinking, what if Nathaniel hadn't been a lawyer? What if no one had been filming?" Clarence took her hand but didn't answer, because they both knew the answer already. Nathaniel Dupree filed the formal complaint with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division before his father had even made it home. The document was precise, detailed, and built the way only a military attorney with something personal at stake could build it. Unlawful detention, warrantless arrest, excessive force, racial profiling, Fourth Amendment violations. Every claim supported by witness testimony, neighbor video from multiple angles, and the timeline of an operation that had no legal basis from the moment the SUVs turned onto Maple Ridge Drive. The DOJ opened an investigation within 48 hours. The case was assigned to a senior civil rights prosecutor who had handled federal law enforcement misconduct cases for over a decade. Simultaneously, the Congressional Black Caucus issued a public statement demanding full accountability and transparency from ICE leadership. A senior senator on the Judiciary Committee called for formal hearings on ICE field operation protocols, citing the arrest as evidence of systemic failure. The DHS Inspector General opened a parallel investigation into Stelling's unit, its operational history, and the supervisory chain that had allowed 9 prior complaints to disappear into filing cabinets. Internal records were subpoenaed, and then the body camera footage arrived. Stelling and Fenton had not been wearing body cameras during the arrest, a direct violation of agency policy. But the 2 backup agents near the vehicles had theirs activated. The footage was recovered from the agency server and reviewed frame by frame. It confirmed everything the neighbors had recorded, and more. Clarence was compliant from the first moment, He identified himself clearly, multiple times. He never raised his voice. He never moved aggressively. He asked for a warrant 3 times and received no answer. The footage showed Stelling initiating physical contact without provocation, and Fenton applying cuffs to a man who had done nothing but stand in his own driveway. Federal investigators watched the footage in a closed briefing room. No one in that room needed to watch it twice. The investigation moved fast because the evidence didn't require interpretation. It required a shovel. The deeper investigators dug into Stelling's unit, the worse it got. Operational records showed a pattern that was impossible to dismiss as coincidence. Over the past 4 years, Stelling's team had conducted 86 field operations in predominantly white neighborhoods across the greater Atlanta metro area. In 61 of those operations, the individuals stopped, detained, or questioned were Black or Latino residents who had no connection to any active immigration case. They were homeowners, renters, commuters, people walking dogs or checking mailboxes, or sitting in parked cars in neighborhoods where someone decided they didn't belong. Complaints from 14 prior incidents were pulled from internal files. Every single one involved a person of color. Every single one had been dismissed internally with language that read like a template. Officer acted within operational discretion. Insufficient evidence to support claim. No further action recommended. Fenton's records added another layer. Investigators found that on 3 prior operations, he had written after-action reports containing fabricated details designed to retroactively justify warrantless stops. In one report, he described a subject as evasive and non-compliant. Witness statements from that same stop described the subject as cooperative and confused. The lies had never been questioned because no one had ever looked. Then came the testimony that broke the case open. A junior agent in Stelling's unit named Omar Bashir requested a meeting with federal investigators. Bashir, 28, had been with ICE for 3 years and assigned to Stelling's team for the last 18 months. He described a culture of racial targeting that operated on instinct rather than evidence. Stelling routinely told his team to trust your gut about who looks like they belong in certain neighborhoods. Bashir said he had filed an internal complaint 6 months before the Dupree arrest, describing the pattern in writing and naming specific incidents. The complaint was received, logged, and never acted on. No one had followed up. No one had interviewed him. No one had reviewed the operations he cited. The system had been told exactly what was happening inside Stelling's unit. It chose not to listen. The outcomes came swiftly because the evidence left no room for delay. Victor Stelling was terminated from Immigration and Customs Enforcement for gross misconduct, violation of Fourth Amendment protections, racial profiling, failure to verify operational targets, and failure to wear a body camera during a field operation. His federal law enforcement certification was revoked. He was referred to the Department of Justice for criminal prosecution on charges of unlawful arrest and deprivation of rights under color of law. The man who had spent 16 years operating on instinct instead of evidence would now face a system that required both. Kyle Fenton was terminated for participation in an unlawful arrest, failure to intervene during the use of excessive force, falsifying details in 3 prior operational reports, and failure to activate his body camera. His certification was suspended pending further review, effectively ending any future in federal law enforcement. The agent who had spent 5 years following without questioning learned that silence carried its own conviction. The regional field office director, who had overseen a system that absorbed 9 complaints against Stelling without consequence, was forced into early retirement. 2 direct supervisors within the unit were demoted and reassigned. The unit itself was disbanded and placed under new leadership with a restructured chain of command. ICE issued a rare public statement acknowledging that the arrest of Clarence Dupree was unlawful and expressing what they called deep regret over the incident and its impact. The statement was carefully worded. It acknowledged the failure, it referenced the reforms being implemented, but it stopped short of a direct apology to Clarence or his family. Reporters noticed, the public noticed, And Clarence, sitting in his living room watching the statement air on the evening news, noticed most of all. "Regret is what you feel when you spill coffee," he said quietly to Evelyn. "Not when you drag a man off his own property in handcuffs." Clarence filed the federal civil rights lawsuit 3 weeks later. The case was brought against ICE, Victor Stelling, Kyle Fenton, and the Department of Homeland Security. It cited unlawful arrest, excessive force, Fourth Amendment violations, racial profiling, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Evelyn Dupree was named as a co-plaintiff for the emotional damages she suffered, watching her husband be detained from their bedroom window, unable to intervene, unable to breathe, unable to do anything but stand behind glass while the people who were supposed to protect them put her husband in cuffs. The evidence was overwhelming. Neighbor videos from 5 angles, body camera footage from the 2 backup agents, internal operational records showing the wrong address, Stelling's 9 prior complaints, Fenton's falsified reports, Omar Bashir's whistleblower testimony, and the internal memo that proved the agency had been warned about Stelling twice and chose to do nothing. The case never made it to trial. The government settled for a multi-million-dollar amount that legal analysts described as one of the largest individual payouts in a federal civil rights case involving ICE. But the money was only part of it. As part of the settlement, the Department of Homeland Security agreed to mandatory warrant verification protocols, requiring field confirmation of target addresses before any engagement, required body camera activation for all field operations, with zero-tolerance enforcement for non-compliance, independent civilian review of all complaints involving racial profiling or discriminatory conduct, and a complete redesign of implicit bias training developed in partnership with civil rights organizations. Clarence donated a significant portion of the settlement to establish a legal defense fund for citizens wrongfully detained by federal agents, people who didn't have a son in the JAG Corps, neighbors with cameras, or a career that demanded recognition, people who had no one to call. Now they would. Weeks later, Clarence Dupree sat on his front porch at 6:40 in the morning. Same slippers, same robe, new coffee mug. The newspaper was tucked under his arm. The garden along the fence line was freshly tended, the beds he had planted the spring before now in full bloom. The American flag hung from the same hook it had always hung from, catching the first light the way it did every morning on Maple Ridge Drive. Ruth Engelman waved from her porch next door. Donald Pratt nodded from his driveway. The street was quiet again. But something had changed. Not the street. The street looked the same as it always had. What changed was what people now understood could happen on it. Clarence began speaking publicly in the months that followed. Not on cable news panels or viral clips, but in the rooms where it mattered. Police academies, congressional briefings, community forums in cities where families like his had stories that never made the news. He told his story the same way every time. Not with anger, not with bitterness, with precision. The same precision he had brought to 34 years behind the badge. "I wore a badge for 34 years, he would say. I know what it's supposed to mean. I know the weight of it. And I know exactly what it looks like when someone forgets." Victor Stelling was last seen leaving a federal courthouse in downtown Atlanta 3 months after his termination. No cameras followed him, no reporters called his name. The career he had built on instinct and impunity was gone, replaced by a case number and a court date. His name now appeared in training manuals distributed across DHS field offices nationally, cited as a case study in what unchecked authority and racial bias produce when no one is held accountable, until someone finally is. A training bulletin circulated through every ICE field office in the country that fall. It showed a single still frame pulled from Donald Pratt's video. A black man in a bathrobe, hands cuffed behind his back, pressed against his own truck in his own driveway. An American flag hanging in the background. Beneath the image, 2 lines in bold type. "This is what failure looks like." No names were printed. They didn't need to be, because the careers were already gone. This case was disturbing, but the one on the right ends in a way no one expects.
Step away from the truck! Hands up, now!
I live here. What's this about?
Don't lie to me. We know who you are.
My name is Elijah Drummond. I'm a U.S. citizen.
Yeah, that's what you all say when you get caught!
You're on my injury. I'm not resisting.
What's going on over there?
At 6:42 a.m. on a quiet residential street in Columbus, Georgia, 3 unmarked black SUVs blocked the driveway of a single-story brick home with an American flag hanging from the porch. 6 ICE agents in full tactical gear surrounded a black man in gym shorts and a faded Army t-shirt as he loaded a toolbox into the bed of his pickup truck for work. Before he could turn around, 2 agents grabbed him by the arms, forced him face down onto his own concrete driveway, and zip-tied his wrists behind his back. They were shouting about a deportation warrant. The man was Staff Sergeant Elijah Drummond, retired, a United States citizen born 38 years ago in the same city where his face was now pressed into the pavement. He was a Purple Heart recipient, a 2-tour combat veteran who had taken shrapnel in Fallujah, protecting the same flag now stitched onto the sleeves of the men pinning him down. The agents had no judicial warrant, no criminal warrant, no arrest order with his name on it. They had the wrong address, the wrong target, and the wrong man. And standing at the screen door 6 feet away, watching her father held to the ground by armed strangers, was his 7-year-old daughter Nyla, screaming so loudly the neighbors could hear it from inside their homes. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from, and make sure to subscribe because the next story is one you don't want to miss. Elijah Drummond had lived in Columbus his entire life. He grew up on the South Side, raised by a single mother who worked double shifts at the textile plant. He was quiet, disciplined, and built for structure. He enlisted in the United States Army at 18, the day after his high school graduation. Infantry. He shipped out within months and never looked back. Over the next 14 years, Elijah rose through the ranks on 2 combat deployments, first to Iraq and then to Afghanistan. He earned his promotions the hard way, in firefights and field operations, where decisions were made in seconds and mistakes were measured in bodies. It was during his second tour in Fallujah that an IED detonated beneath his convoy. The blast killed 2 members of his squad instantly. Elijah survived with a titanium plate in his left leg and partial hearing loss in his right ear. For his actions that day, the Army awarded him the Purple Heart. He came home with an honorable discharge, a box of commendations, and a body that reminded him every morning of what he had given. He settled back in Columbus, took a job as a licensed electrician, married a woman named Simone, and built a life that was small and steady. When Simone was diagnosed with cancer, he cared for her until the end. That was 2 years ago. Since then, Elijah had raised Nyla on his own. He braided her hair before school. He coached Little League on Saturdays. He went to work, came home, and kept his house clean. He was respected on his block, known by name at the hardware store, and never once asked the world to notice what he had sacrificed. He was the kind of man who gave everything and expected nothing in return. And on that Tuesday morning, his country repaid him by putting his face on his own driveway and making his daughter watch. The lead agent was Supervisory Deportation Officer Vincent Taggart, 44 years old, 16 years with Immigration and Customs Enforcement. He had built his career on volume. His unit ran more enforcement operations per quarter than any other in the southeastern region, a number his supervisors praised in performance reviews without ever asking how it was achieved. The answer was speed. Taggart's teams moved fast, verified little, and relied on instinct over paperwork. Among field agents, he was known as a closer. Among immigration attorneys and civil rights groups, he was known as something else entirely. Over the course of his career, 7 formal complaints had been filed against Taggart for rights violations, including 2 wrongful detentions of U.S. citizens, one involving a 63-year-old Puerto Rican grandmother held for 11 hours before anyone confirmed her citizenship. Every complaint had been administratively cleared. No discipline, no retraining, no record that followed him into his next operation. His second that morning was Field Agent Brent Nolan, 31, 4 years on the job. Nolan had joined ICE straight out of a criminal justice program and landed under Taggart's supervision within his first year. He learned quickly what was rewarded and what wasn't. Taggart liked agents who moved when he moved, talked when he talked, and never questioned a call in the field. Nolan became that agent. He mirrored Taggart's aggression because it earned approval, and he stayed silent when things went wrong because that earned even more. That morning, the team had been dispatched to execute an administrative deportation warrant for a Guatemalan national named Carlos Mejia Solano. The target address was 412 Birchwood Lane. Elijah Drummond lived at 414 Magnolia Drive, 2 blocks south. The names didn't match. The addresses didn't match. But Taggart never verified either one. He saw a black man outside a house in the general vicinity and decided that was close enough. Taggart reached Elijah before he even had time to set the toolbox down. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands where I can see them." Elijah turned slowly, palms open, arms at his sides. "I live here. What's going on?" 2 agents flanked him immediately. A third stood near the truck bed, hand on his holster. Taggart didn't answer the question. "Are you Carlos Mejia Solano?" Elijah's brow furrowed. "Number. My name is Elijah Drummond. I'm a U.S. citizen. This is my house." Taggart stepped closer. "We have a warrant. Turn around." Elijah kept his voice steady. "Sir, my ID is inside the house. My daughter is right there. Let me show you who I am." Taggart glanced at the screen door where Nyla stood in her pajamas, eyes wide, hands pressed to the mesh. He looked back at Elijah without acknowledging her. "Turn around. Now." Elijah complied. He placed his hands behind his back slowly, deliberately, the same way he had been trained to move in situations where one wrong gesture could change everything. 2 agents grabbed his arms and forced him down. His knees hit the concrete first, then his chest, then the side of his face. The impact reopened a scar above his left eyebrow. Zip ties were cinched around his wrists so tightly the plastic cut into his skin within seconds. Then Nolan knelt on his back. The knee landed directly on the lower left side, exactly where the shrapnel had torn through muscle and tissue 14 years earlier in Fallujah. Elijah's breath left him in a sharp gasp. "I have a combat injury. You're on my wound. Please move your knee." Nolan pressed harder. "Stop talking." Elijah gritted his teeth, face against the pavement, eyes squeezed shut. "I'm not resisting. I'm telling you, I'm injured." "Shut up," Nolan said. Across the street, a door opened. Gwendolyn Price, 68 years old, a retired school teacher who had lived in the neighborhood for over 30 years, stepped onto her porch in a bathrobe. She saw the SUVs, the tactical gear, and Elijah face down on his own driveway. She went back inside, came out with her phone, and began recording without saying a word. 2 houses down, Franklin Osei watched from his front window, then picked up his phone and dialed 911. "There are armed men in tactical gear on my neighbor's driveway. They've got him on the ground. I don't know who they are. There's no marked vehicles. Please send someone." And through it all, Nyla stood at the screen door, crying, calling out the only word that mattered. "Daddy, Daddy, Daddy." Not one agent turned to look at her. Taggart stood over Elijah and keyed his radio. "Dispatch, confirm physical description on target Mejia Solano." There was a pause, then the dispatcher's voice came back flat and clear. "Target is male, 5'6", approximately 140 pounds, age 27. Taggart looked down at Elijah. Elijah was 6'2", over 200 pounds, and 38 years old. The name was wrong. The height was wrong. The age was wrong. Everything was wrong. Taggart released the radio button and said nothing for a long moment. Then he turned to Nolan, who still had his knee on Elijah's back. "Keep him restrained. We're sorting this out." Elijah spoke through clenched teeth. "There's nothing to sort out. My name is on the mailbox. My ID is inside the front door. You have the wrong person." Taggart didn't respond. A third agent, one of the younger members of the team, walked toward the house and stopped at the screen door. Nyla was still standing there, tears running down her face, her small hands flat against the mesh. The agent looked at her for a moment, then turned and walked back toward the SUVs without a word. He didn't speak to her, didn't tell her it was going to be okay, didn't call for anyone to come be with her. He just left a 7-year-old girl standing alone behind a door, watching her father bleed on the concrete. From across the street, Gwendolyn Price raised her voice for the first time. "That man is a veteran. He's lived in that house for years. You have the wrong person." Taggart turned toward her porch. His expression didn't change. "Ma'am, we determine who's who, not you. A lot of people claim things they're not." The words carried clearly across the morning air. Gwendolyn's phone caught every syllable. So did the Ring doorbell camera mounted on Franklin Osei's front door directly across the street, recording in high definition with a timestamp in the corner of the frame. Gwendolyn didn't lower her phone. She didn't go back inside. She stood on her porch in her bathrobe and kept recording. Because she had spent 30 years teaching children the difference between right and wrong, and she knew exactly which one she was looking at. The first Columbus PD cruiser arrived 7 minutes after Franklin's 911 call. Officer Janelle Sutton stepped out, assessed the scene quickly: 3 unmarked SUVs, 6 agents in tactical gear, a man face down on a residential driveway, and a child visible through the screen door of the home. She approached with her hand near her radio, not her weapon. Then she saw his face. She stopped walking. "That's Sergeant Drummond." Her voice was sharp, immediate, and certain. Her 12-year-old son Caleb played shortstop on the Little League team Elijah coached every Saturday at Linden Park. She had watched Elijah run drills with those kids for 2 seasons. She had spoken to him at games, at team cookouts, at the end-of-year award ceremony. She knew exactly who he was. She turned to Taggart. "That man is a United States citizen. He was born in this city. He's a combat veteran. What are you doing?" Taggart straightened. "We're federal agents executing a lawful operation. Step back, officer." Sutton didn't move. She looked at Elijah's face, the blood above his eyebrow, the zip ties cutting into his wrists, the swelling along his left side where Nolan's knee had been pressing for nearly 15 minutes. She keyed her radio. "Sergeant Covington, this is Sutton at Magnolia Drive. I need a supervisor here now. We have federal agents detaining a U.S. citizen." Wrong target, wrong address, possible excessive force. Sergeant Ray Covington arrived 4 minutes later in an unmarked sedan. He walked directly to Taggart and extended his hand. "Let me see the warrant." Taggart hesitated, then handed it over. Covington read it once, then looked up. "This warrant is for Carlos Mejia Solano at 412 Birchwood Lane. This is 414 Magnolia Drive. The man on the ground is not your target. He's not even in your system. You have the wrong man at the wrong house. Release him. Now." Taggart didn't move immediately. He looked at Nolan. He looked at the other agents standing near the SUVs. He looked at Gwendolyn, still recording from her porch. At the neighbors now gathered on the sidewalk. At Sutton standing between him and the house, with her body camera blinking red. 11 minutes passed. 11 minutes in which a man whose citizenship, identity, and address had all been confirmed remained face down on his own property in zip ties. Then finally, Taggart pulled a blade from his vest and cut the ties. He didn't say a word. No apology, no explanation. He just cut the plastic and stepped back, as if releasing Elijah erased everything that had happened in the 23 minutes before it. Elijah stood slowly. It took him 3 attempts. His left leg, the one carrying 14 years of titanium and scar tissue, buckled twice before it held. The knee pressure from Nolan had driven directly into the old wound, and the pain radiated from his hip to his ankle in sharp, pulsing waves. His face was scraped raw on the right side where the concrete had ground into his skin. A cut above his left eyebrow had bled down past his jaw and onto the collar of his army t-shirt, which was torn at the shoulder seam. Both wrists were lined with deep red grooves from the zip ties, the skin broken in 2 places, blood already drying in thin streaks across his palms. He flexed his right arm and winced. His shoulder had been wrenched during the takedown and now hung slightly lower than the other. He stood there on his own driveway, surrounded by his own neighbors, in front of his own home, bleeding from wounds inflicted by men who had never once confirmed his name. The screen door flew open. Nyla ran to him barefoot across the concrete and wrapped both arms around his waist, pressing her face into his stomach, sobbing so hard her whole body shook. Elijah brought one arm around her and held her close. The other arm hung at his side because he could barely lift it. He didn't say a word. He just rested his chin on top of her head and closed his eyes. Gwendolyn crossed the street with tears streaming down her face. Franklin stood at the edge of the driveway, fists clenched, jaw tight. Other neighbors gathered on the sidewalk in bathrobes and work clothes, some holding coffee, some holding phones, all of them silent. Elijah's toolbox lay overturned near the truck bed, tools scattered across the driveway. His truck door was still open, the engine cold. He didn't look at the agents, didn't speak to them, didn't ask for an explanation or an apology. He just held his daughter. Officer Sutton approached quietly and stood a few feet away until Elijah opened his eyes.
Sergeant Drummond, I'm going to make sure every piece of this is documented. My body camera has been running since I arrived.
She paused. I'm sorry this happened to you. Elijah nodded once, but said nothing. Across the street, mounted beneath the eave of Franklin O'Sea's front porch, a Ring doorbell camera had recorded the entire encounter from start to finish. 23 minutes of uninterrupted footage. Every agent, every order, every second Nyla spent screaming behind that screen door. It had captured all of it, and it was already saved to the cloud. Gwendolyn Price uploaded her phone video at 9:14 that morning. She posted it without commentary, just a 12-minute clip titled, "They did this to a veteran on his own driveway." Franklin O'Sea uploaded the Ring footage an hour later, all 23 minutes, time-stamped and unedited. By noon, both videos had been shared thousands of times. By 3 p.m., a veterans advocacy page with over 2 million followers reposted the Ring footage with a single caption: Purple Heart recipient, U.S.-born citizen, wrong address, wrong man, no apology. The clip exploded. By evening, the combined views crossed 2 million. By the next morning, they had passed 6. The image that defined the story wasn't the takedown or the knee on his back. It was a single frame from the Ring camera, pulled and screenshotted by thousands of people independently, as if they had all recognized the same unbearable detail at the same moment. In the frame, Elijah lay face down on the concrete, arms zip-tied behind his back, blood visible on his forehead. Behind him, the front door of his home was slightly ajar, and hanging from a bracket on the porch, directly above the scene, was an American flag, still and limp in the windless morning air. That image spread faster than the video itself. Veterans organizations issued furious public statements. 3 congressional offices released responses before lunch. Civil rights attorneys began calling Elijah's phone, leaving voicemails offering representation. Local news led with the story at 5 and 6. National outlets picked it up by the following morning. Anchors described the footage. Legal analysts broke down the Fourth Amendment violations. Retired military officers went on camera and said what millions were already thinking. He bled for this country, and this country sent armed men to his driveway who didn't even bother to check his name. And in a quiet office inside ICE's Southeastern Field headquarters, someone pulled up the Ring footage on a government computer, watched the first 4 minutes, and immediately forwarded it to the regional director with a single line in the email. We have a serious problem. ICE headquarters in Washington released a statement at 4:47 p.m. the following day, nearly 32 hours after the arrest. It was 3 sentences long. The statement described the incident as a procedural discrepancy during a routine enforcement action and said the agency was conducting an internal review. It concluded by affirming that all agents involved had followed standard operational protocol. There was no mention of Elijah's name, no mention of his military service, no mention of Nyla, no acknowledgement that the warrant had been for a different person at a different address. The statement read like it had been drafted by someone who had never watched the footage, or, more likely, by someone who had watched every second of it and understood exactly how much needed to be buried. That same day, Taggart filed his official incident report. In it, he described Elijah as initially uncooperative and stated that the subject failed to comply with verbal commands, necessitating physical restraint. He wrote that force used was proportional to the circumstances and consistent with field protocol for high-risk enforcement operations. Nolan filed his report the following morning. It echoed Taggart's nearly word for word, same phrasing, same structure, same calculated omissions. Neither report mentioned that the dispatcher had read back a physical description that didn't match Elijah. Neither mentioned Gwendolyn's repeated attempts to tell them they had the wrong man. Neither mentioned Nyla standing at the screen door. Neither mentioned the 11 minutes Taggart waited after Sergeant Covington told them to release Elijah. But the videos told a completely different story, and by that point, millions of people had already seen them. Within 48 hours, congressional inquiries began flooding into the Department of Homeland Security. 12 members of the House, 4 senators, and the chair of the Congressional Black Caucus demanded a formal review. The DHS Office of Inspector General opened an investigation. The IG team moved quickly. They pulled GPS logs from all 3 SUVs, confirming the vehicles had never been within 2 blocks of the correct target address. They pulled radio transcripts and found the dispatch correction Taggart had received and acknowledged 7 minutes into the encounter, a correction he never acted on for another 10 minutes. Then they pulled Taggart's phone. In his text messages, sent to a colleague 40 minutes after Elijah was released, was a single line that would later be read aloud in a federal courtroom. Got the wrong one, but he was acting like he had something to hide anyway. The Department of Justice Civil Rights Division opened its own parallel investigation 9 days after the arrest. The lead was a senior trial attorney from the criminal section, supported by 2 FBI agents and a federal civil rights analyst. They were not there to review policy. They were there to determine whether federal crimes had been committed. Their first interview was with Elijah. He arrived in a pressed shirt, a folder of documents under his arm, and gave his statement with the same precision he had once used to deliver field reports under fire. He provided timestamps down to the minute. He recalled exact phrases, who said what and when. He described the location of each agent on the driveway, the angle of his body when he was taken down, the point of contact where Nolan's knee met his shrapnel wound. He described Nyla's position at the screen door and the moment the third agent looked at her and walked away without speaking. He did not raise his voice. He did not editorialize. He delivered the facts like a man who had spent his life in environments where facts were the difference between living and dying. The investigators then interviewed Gwendolyn Price, whose video had become the most viewed clip associated with the case. She described what she saw from her porch and repeated Taggart's words exactly. A lot of people claim things they're not. Franklin Osei provided the ring footage directly from his cloud account and confirmed the timestamps. Officer Janelle Sutton gave a detailed statement corroborated by her own body camera footage. 6 additional neighbors provided statements, all consistent, all describing the same sequence of events from different vantage points. Then the investigators subpoenaed ICE internal records. What they found went far beyond one morning in Columbus. Taggart's unit had accumulated 14 formal complaints of wrongful detention in just 3 years. The targets were disproportionately Black and Latino U.S. citizens and legal residents. 7 of the 14 complaints involved operations conducted at addresses that did not match the warrants being executed. In each case, the agents had detained individuals based on proximity and appearance rather than verified identity. Not one of the 14 complaints had resulted in discipline. Not a single reprimand. Not a single retraining order. Not a single suspension. The pattern was unmistakable. This was not a one-time mistake made by a careless agent on a Tuesday morning. This was an institutional failure, built on speed, protected by silence, and enabled by a system that treated zero accountability as standard operating procedure. Elijah chose his attorney carefully. He didn't go with the first name on the list or the loudest voice in his voicemail. He chose Constance Adeyemi, a former federal prosecutor who had spent 8 years inside the Department of Justice before leaving to represent the people the government failed. She had built a reputation on cases no one else wanted to touch, suing federal agencies, challenging qualified immunity, and winning settlements that came with structural reform attached. She didn't take cases for headlines. She took them for precedent. When she sat down with Elijah for the first time, she listened for 2 hours without interrupting. Then she told him what she intended to do. Within 3 weeks, Adeyemi filed a federal civil rights lawsuit in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Georgia. The defendants named were Supervisory Deportation Officer Vincent Taggart, Field Agent Brent Nolan, 4 additional agents present on the driveway that morning, the director of ICE's Southeastern Field Office, and the Department of Homeland Security itself. The complaint ran 47 pages. It alleged unlawful arrest without probable cause, excessive force in violation of the Fourth Amendment, racial profiling, intentional infliction of emotional distress on both Elijah and his minor daughter, and negligent supervision by the field office and DHS for failing to discipline or retrain agents with documented histories of civil rights violations. Adeyemi subpoenaed Taggart's full disciplinary file. What came back confirmed what the DOJ investigation had already begun to uncover, but in sharper, more damning detail. The 7 prior complaints were laid out in full. One involved a 24-year-old Latino legal resident detained during a workplace raid despite presenting a valid green card. Another described a black mother of 3 pulled from her vehicle at a gas station while her children sat in the back seat. Agents held her for 45 minutes before confirming she was a U.S. citizen. But the worst was a case from 2 years earlier. A 70-year-old black man named Cornelius Beckett, a retired postal worker and U.S. citizen born in Macon, Georgia, was picked up during an enforcement sweep outside a bus station. He was transported to a federal detention facility 90 miles away. He told every person who would listen that he was an American citizen. No one checked for 9 hours. When they finally ran his information, they confirmed he was exactly who he said he was. He was released without explanation. The complaint on that case had been reviewed and closed with 3 words written at the bottom of the file: no action required. Adeyemi included every word of that case in her filing. She wanted the court to see not just what happened to Elijah Drummond, but what had been allowed to happen to others before him, and what would keep happening if no one was held accountable. The case reached Congress 5 weeks after the lawsuit was filed. The House Judiciary Subcommittee on Immigration and Citizenship announced a formal hearing on ICE enforcement practices, and Elijah Drummond was invited to testify. He arrived in Washington on a Tuesday morning wearing a dark suit, a pressed white shirt, and his Purple Heart pinned to his left lapel. He sat at a long wooden table facing the committee, a microphone in front of him, cameras behind him, and a room full of staffers, reporters, and spectators watching from every seat. He did not bring prepared remarks. He spoke from memory, the way he had given field reports for 14 years. He described the morning simply and completely: the toolbox, the SUVs, the agents, the orders, the takedown. He described the concrete against his face and the zip ties cutting into his wrists. He described the knee on his shrapnel wound and the way his vision blurred from the pain. He described asking them to check his ID and being told to shut up. Then he paused. He looked directly into the camera and described his daughter. He described Nyla standing at the screen door in her pajamas. He described the sound of her screaming for him while armed men held him on the ground. He described the agent who walked to the door, looked at her, and turned away without a word. The room was silent. No one moved. No one typed. Then Elijah said, "I bled for this country in Fallujah. I left pieces of myself in the sand so that families like mine could be safe at home. And I came home, and this country sent armed men to my driveway to treat me like I didn't belong here. like I wasn't American enough, like my citizenship needed to be earned twice because of the color of my skin. A committee member turned to the acting ICE director, seated at a separate table across the room. How was this allowed to happen? The director adjusted his microphone. He spoke about operational protocols, about ongoing internal reviews, about the agency's commitment to accountability and professionalism. He used the phrase standard procedure 3 times. He did not say Elijah's name. He did not mention Nyla. He did not answer the question. Clips of Elijah's testimony were posted online within the hour. By evening, they had been viewed over 8 million times. The image of a Purple Heart veteran sitting calmly before Congress, describing how his own government treated him like a criminal in front of his child, became the second defining frame of the case. The first was the flag above the driveway. The second was the medal on his chest. And neither one could be explained away. The federal grand jury returned indictments 6 weeks after the DOJ investigation concluded. Supervisory Deportation Officer Vincent Taggart was charged with 2 counts of deprivation of rights under color of law, under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, and 1 count of filing false statements in a federal report. Field Agent Brent Nolan was charged with 1 count of deprivation of rights and 1 count of accessory to false reporting. Both men were arrested on the same morning, Taggart at his home in Hinesville, Nolan at his apartment in Savannah. They were processed, fingerprinted, and released on bond. Neither spoke to the press. Within a week, the director of ICE's Southeastern Field Office submitted his resignation. No public statement accompanied it, no press conference, no acknowledgement of what had happened under his authority. He simply stepped down and disappeared from the agency directory, as if removing his name could separate him from the 14 complaints, the 7 wrong addresses, and the culture of zero oversight he had allowed to metastasize inside his operation. 3 additional agents from Taggart's unit were placed on indefinite, unpaid suspension, pending further review of their involvement in prior wrongful detentions. Their access credentials were revoked. Their service weapons were collected. Taggart's trial began on a Monday in the United States District Court for the Middle District of Georgia. It lasted 2 weeks. The prosecution opened with the ring footage. 23 minutes of uninterrupted video played on a screen mounted above the jury box. The jurors watched Elijah taken to the ground. They watched Nolan's knee press into his back. They watched Nyla standing behind the screen door, her mouth open, her hands flat against the mesh. They heard every word. Then the prosecution played Gwendolyn's phone video, which captured Taggart's voice clearly. A lot of people claim things they're not. They played the radio transcript in which the dispatcher read back a description that matched nothing about Elijah, and Taggart acknowledged it. Then they entered the text message into evidence. Got the wrong one, but he was acting like he had something to hide anyway. The defense argued it was an honest mistake, a high-pressure operation, a regrettable error in the fog of field enforcement. The attorney described Taggart as a dedicated public servant with 16 years of experience who made a split-second judgment call. He asked the jury to consider the difficulty of the work, the danger of enforcement operations, and the impossibility of perfection. The prosecution responded by replaying the 11 minutes Taggart waited after being told to release Elijah. 11 minutes after a Columbus PD supervisor stood in front of him, holding the wrong warrant, and said plainly that the man on the ground was not the man they were looking for. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. They returned guilty on all counts. Taggart was sentenced to 30 months in federal prison. The judge noted the flagrant disregard for a citizen's constitutional rights, the physical harm inflicted on a decorated combat veteran, and the emotional trauma caused to a minor child who watched her father brutalized from inside her own home. Nolan received 14 months. The judge described him as a willing participant who chose obedience over conscience and silence over intervention. Both men were permanently barred from federal law enforcement. Their credentials were revoked. Their names were entered into the National Decertification Index. Neither would carry a badge again. The civil lawsuit settled 4 months before it was scheduled to go to trial. Constance Adeyemi had built a case so thoroughly documented and so publicly visible that the Department of Homeland Security's attorneys had no room to maneuver. The video evidence alone was devastating. Combined with the disciplinary records, the dispatcher transcripts, the text message, and the testimony of 9 witnesses, the government's legal team understood that a jury trial would not produce a more favorable outcome than what was already on the table. DHS agreed to a settlement of $4.2 million, one of the largest individual payouts in an ICE wrongful arrest case in the agency's history. The money was significant, but Adeyemi had made clear from the beginning that a check alone was not acceptable. The settlement included a binding set of structural reforms imposed on ICE's Southeastern Field Office and recommended for adoption agency-wide. Mandatory address and identity verification protocols were required before any enforcement action could be initiated. No agent could approach a target location without confirmed cross-referencing of the warrant name, physical description, and address against at least 2 independent databases. An independent review process was established for all complaints involving U.S. citizens or legal permanent residents, removing the authority of field office supervisors to close complaints without external oversight. Quarterly public reporting on wrongful detentions was mandated, including demographic data on the individuals affected. And a civilian oversight board was created for the regional field office, with the authority to review operations, access complaint files, and issue binding recommendations. Elijah sat in Adeyemi's office the day the settlement was finalized. He read every page. He signed where he needed to sign. Then he told her what he wanted to do with a portion of the money. He established a legal defense fund for U.S. citizens and lawful residents wrongfully targeted by immigration enforcement. People who didn't have cameras rolling, didn't have neighbors willing to record, didn't have a decorated military record to force the system to pay attention. The fund would connect them with attorneys, cover legal costs, and ensure their cases didn't vanish into the same administrative silence that had swallowed the 14 complaints before his. He named the fund after his late wife, the Simone Drummond Justice Fund, because she had believed, even when the world gave her every reason not to, that doing the right thing still mattered. Elijah went back to work 3 weeks after the settlement was finalized. He loaded his toolbox into the same truck, drove to the same job sites, and pulled wire through the same walls he had been pulling wire through for years. He picked Nyla up from school at 3:15 every afternoon. He coached Little League on Saturdays at Linden Park, running the same drills, standing behind the same backstop, clapping for the same kids who didn't know or care what had happened on his driveway. He didn't give interviews. He didn't write a book. He didn't go on tour. He went back to the life he had built because that life was the whole point. The only visible change was the driveway. He had it repaved 2 weeks after the settlement. Smooth concrete, no cracks, no scuff marks, no blood-stained patch where his face had been pressed into the ground. He didn't do it for himself. He did it because Nyla walked across that driveway every morning on her way to the school bus, and he didn't want her to look down and remember. Gwendolyn Price still lived across the street. She still waved to Elijah every morning when he loaded his truck. On her refrigerator, held up by a magnet from her church, was a printed screenshot of the moment her video passed 1 million views. She never posted another video in her life. She didn't need to. She had done what needed doing when it needed doing, and that was enough. Officer Janelle Sutton received a formal commendation from the Columbus Police Department for her intervention that morning. Her sergeant wrote in the citation that her actions represented the highest standards of professional conduct and community trust. She never spoke publicly about the case, but at the next Little League game, she sat in the bleachers behind home plate and watched her son take the field, coached by the same man she had found face down on his own property, and she knew exactly what her badge was supposed to mean. Vincent Taggart served his 30-month sentence at a federal correctional facility in Jessup, Georgia. His former profession earned him no respect inside those walls. He kept to himself, filed no appeals, and made no public statements. When he was released, he left the state. His name returned nothing in law enforcement databases except a revoked credential and a case number. Brent Nolan served 14 months at a minimum security facility in Montgomery, Alabama. After his release, he left law enforcement entirely. He never applied for another badge. He moved to a small town in North Florida where no one knew his name and no one had seen the video. The ICE Southeastern Field Office underwent a full restructuring in the year following the settlement. New leadership was installed. Verification protocols were implemented. The Civilian Oversight Board held its first meeting 60 days after the agreement was signed. Complaint files that had been closed without action were reopened and reassigned to independent reviewers. Quietly, without ceremony, a training bulletin began circulating through DHS offices nationwide. It was one page. At the top was a still frame pulled from Franklin Osei's Ring camera. In the image, a man lay face down on a concrete driveway, wrists bound behind his back. Through the open front door of the house behind him, the edge of a framed Purple Heart certificate was visible on the hallway wall. And in the screen door, backlit by the glow of a kitchen light, was the silhouette of a small child, hands pressed to the mesh. Beneath the image, in plain black text, were 9 words. Verify before you act. This is what failure costs. No names were printed. They didn't need to be. The careers were already gone. Elijah Drummond never spoke publicly about the case again. He didn't need to. The footage spoke for itself. Now, watching footage like this, it can really stick with you, right? Some of these clips stay in your head, especially late at night when you're trying to fall asleep. And speaking of sleep, a lot of you have told me you're waking up at 2 or 3 a.m. and just lying there, can't shut your mind off, and the next day you're dragging through everything. I came across a simple 21-day sleep guide that's helped thousands of people fix exactly that. No pills.
Don't play games with me. You think I don't know what this is?
Sir, it's my vehicle. The registration is inside.
Yeah, I've heard that one before. Nice car, clean story. Guys like you don't just roll through here in something like this.
I'm active duty Navy. I can show you my ID.
At 7:14 a.m. at a rural gas station off Highway 9 in Coulter County, Georgia, a black man in civilian clothes stood at pump number 3, filling a black Chevy Tahoe. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, jeans, and running shoes. Nothing about him drew attention. He wasn't on the phone. He wasn't looking around. He was just pumping gas on a quiet Tuesday morning, the same way millions of Americans do every single day. The man was Senior Chief Darnell Sutton, 38 years old, an active-duty Navy SEAL with 16 years in special operations. He had spent the last 2 weeks on leave visiting his mother in Albany, and now he was driving back to Naval Station Norfolk for a scheduled debrief. His military ID was in his wallet. His registration and insurance were in the glove box. His leave papers were folded inside a manila envelope on the passenger seat. Everything was in order. None of it would matter for the next 40 minutes. A Coulter County Sheriff's cruiser pulled into the station lot and parked diagonally behind the Tahoe, blocking it in. The driver's side door opened slowly. Sheriff Dwight Hargrove stepped out. He was 52 years old, 26 years in the department, elected 3 times by a county that was 68% white and had never once questioned how he ran things. He was tall, broad, and unhurried. His hand rested on his duty belt as he walked toward the pump. His eyes were already locked on Sutton. Not on the vehicle, not on the plates, on the man. Hargrove stopped 6 feet away, feet planted wide, chin tilted up. "That your vehicle?" Sutton turned, nozzle still in hand. "Yes, sir." Hargrove didn't acknowledge the answer. He stepped past Sutton and circled the Tahoe slowly, peering through the tinted windows, running his hand along the rear door frame as if checking for something. He paused at the back, looked at the plates, then looked at Sutton again. "This vehicle matches a stolen report out of Valdosta. Black Tahoe, recent model." Sutton's expression didn't change. His voice stayed even. "I have the registration right in the glove box. I can show you." Hargrove ignored the offer entirely. He didn't ask for the registration, didn't ask for a license, didn't run the plates. Instead, he pointed at the hood. "Step away from the vehicle. Hands on the hood. Now." Sutton set the nozzle back in the pump, stepped forward, and placed both palms flat on the hood of his own car. He didn't argue. He didn't hesitate. 16 years of training had taught him to assess a situation before reacting, and right now, every instinct told him this man had already made up his mind. What Sutton didn't know yet was that 2 cameras were already recording. The gas station's exterior security system captured the lot from 2 angles in continuous, high-definition footage. And 30 feet away, parked near the air pump, a long-haul truck sat idling with a dash cam mounted on the windshield, capturing a wide-angle view of everything unfolding at pump number 3. The driver, a man named Earl Jessup, was inside the station eating a biscuit sandwich. He wouldn't learn what his camera had recorded until hours later, but when he did, that footage would change everything. Hargrove keyed his radio and called for backup. Deputy Ronnie Skaggs, 29 years old, 3 years on the job, Hargrove's hand-picked protege. Skaggs had been hired straight out of the sheriff's personal recommendation. No prior law enforcement experience, no academy honors, just a last name Hargrove knew from church, and a willingness to follow orders without asking questions. He arrived in under 4 minutes, cruiser pulling in fast, gravel popping under the tires. He stepped out and walked straight to Hargrove's side without once looking at Sutton, like a person. Together they ran the plates. The results came back clean. The Tahoe was registered to Darnell Sutton at an address in Virginia Beach, Virginia. The VIN matched. There was no stolen vehicle flag, no warrants, no alerts of any kind. The system had given them every reason to let him go. Hargrove didn't let him go. He looked at the screen on Skaggs's cruiser laptop and shook his head. Registration could be forged. These guys are sophisticated now. Clone a VIN, swap plates, drive it right across state lines. Sutton stood with his palms still flat on the hood of his own vehicle, the morning heat already warming the metal beneath his hands. He spoke without turning around. I have my military ID and leave orders in the vehicle. I'm active duty Navy. I can show you everything right now. Hargrove stepped closer. I don't care about military papers. You can buy a uniform at any surplus store. Doesn't mean you earned it. Skaggs laughed, a short, ugly sound that carried across the lot. Sutton said nothing. His fingers pressed harder into the hood, but he didn't move. Hargrove walked to the passenger side of the Tahoe and tried the handle. It was locked. He turned to Sutton. Open it. Sutton kept his voice level. I do not consent to a search. There's no probable cause. Hargrove didn't pause. He turned to Skaggs. Open it. We've got exigent circumstances. There were no exigent circumstances. No weapon in plain view, no odor of contraband, no indication of danger. Just a clean registration, a cooperating man, and 2 officers who had already decided what they wanted to find. Skaggs used a Slim Jim from his cruiser to pop the lock. They started with the back seat. A duffel bag, zipped open and dumped across the seat. Gym clothes, toiletries, a paperback novel. Then the garment bag. Skaggs unzipped it and pulled out a set of navy dress blues, pressed and squared away, ribbons pinned in perfect order. Hargrove took the uniform from Skaggs and held it up by the hanger, turning it in the light like a prop. He looked at Skaggs with a half grin. You ever seen a real Navy SEAL? Skaggs glanced at Sutton, then back at the uniform. Not one that looks like him. They both laughed. Sutton heard every word. His jaw tightened. His breathing stayed controlled. Behind the gas station counter, a young white woman named Colleen Fitch stood motionless, her phone raised to the window, recording. She had started filming the moment the second cruiser pulled in. She didn't say a word. She didn't need to. The camera was catching everything, the laughter, the uniform held up like a joke, and the man at the hood who had earned every ribbon on it, standing in silence while 2 men who hadn't mocked him for it. Hargrove pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt and grabbed Sutton's left wrist without warning. Turn around, hands behind your back. Sutton turned slowly, keeping his movements deliberate. What am I being charged with? Suspicion of grand theft auto and possession of stolen property. Hargrove snapped the first cuff tight. The plates came back clean, Sutton said. The VIN matches my registration. You know this vehicle isn't stolen. Hargrove yanked the second wrist back and locked the cuff. We'll sort that out at the station. Out on Highway 9, cars had begun to slow. A white minivan with a family inside drifted past at half speed, the mother in the passenger seat staring through the window, one hand over her mouth. A pickup truck pulled onto the shoulder briefly, then moved on. A man on a motorcycle slowed, looked, and kept riding. They all saw the same thing. A black man in handcuffs standing beside his own vehicle while two officers treated him like he'd committed the crime of the century. Hargrove gripped Sutton by the back of the neck and steered him toward the cruiser. When they reached the rear door, Hargrove pushed Sutton's head down hard, far harder than necessary. Sutton's shoulder caught the edge of the door frame. The impact twisted his upper body sideways, and his forehead struck the plexiglass partition inside the cruiser. A small cut opened just above his left eyebrow. A thin line of blood ran down toward his eyelid. Sutton didn't cry out, didn't flinch, didn't say a word. He sat back against the seat, hands cuffed behind him, blood slowly tracking down the side of his face, and he breathed. Slow and measured. The way he'd been trained to breathe when everything around him was falling apart. The way he breathed in rooms most people would never know existed. He waited. At the Coulter County Sheriff's Office, Sutton was processed like a man who had committed a violent felony. They took his mugshot under fluorescent lights, the cut above his eyebrow still fresh, blood dried in a thin line down his temple. They rolled his fingerprints. They confiscated his wallet, his phone, his watch, his military ID, and the manila envelope containing his leave orders. Every item was bagged, tagged, and placed in a locker behind the intake desk, as if it were evidence in a murder case. He was walked down a narrow hallway and placed in a holding cell with a concrete bench and a steel toilet. The door locked behind him with a sound that echoed off every wall. Sutton sat on the bench. I'd like to make a phone call. Hargrove stood on the other side of the bars, arms crossed. You'll get one when we're done processing. Then he walked away. 1 hour passed, then 2, then 3. No phone call, no water, no update, no explanation. The processing had taken less than 15 minutes. The rest was silence and concrete. Down the hall in Hargrove's office, the sheriff and his deputies sat across from each other writing their arrest report. The document they produced bore almost no resemblance to what had happened at that gas station. It stated that the subject was evasive and uncooperative during questioning. It stated that the subject made furtive movements toward the vehicle, consistent with an attempt to flee. It stated that the subject refused to provide identification and became verbally combative when asked to comply with lawful orders. Every line was a lie. Every sentence was designed to justify what the cameras had already proven was unjustifiable. And while Hargrove signed his name at the bottom of that report, the black Chevy Tahoe sat in the station's impound lot, already confirmed clean through 3 separate database checks. No stolen flag, no VIN discrepancy, no alert of any kind. Hargrove had seen the results. He had buried them. Because admitting the vehicle was clean meant admitting the arrest was wrong. And Dwight Hargrove had not admitted he was wrong in 26 years. He wasn't going to start now. After 3 hours and 47 minutes, Hargrove appeared at the holding cell door. You get one call. Sutton stood, walked to the desk phone at the end of the hallway, and dialed a number from memory. He didn't call a lawyer. He didn't call his mother. He called his commanding officer at Naval Special Warfare Command in Coronado, California. The call lasted less than 3 minutes. Sutton spoke in short, precise sentences. He gave his name, rank, and service number. He stated his location. He described the stop, the search, the cuffs, the cut on his forehead, the fabricated charge, and the 4 hours without a phone call or water. He said, I'm being held at the Coulter County Sheriff's Office in Georgia. The vehicle is mine. The plates are clean. They know it's clean. His commanding officer, Captain Leon Briggs, asked one question. Are you injured? Small cut above my eyebrow. I'm fine. Briggs said, sit tight. We're making calls. The line went dead. Within 20 minutes, Captain Briggs had contacted NCIS,
the Navy JAG Corps, and the Department of Defense Liaison for Law Enforcement Affairs. Within 40 minutes, phones were ringing at the Coulter County Sheriff's Office from numbers with Washington, D.C. area codes. The desk sergeant, a woman named Pam Gunther who had worked the front desk for 9 years, answered the first call with the same flat tone she used for noise complaints and parking disputes. She didn't understand what was happening. The voice on the line asked to speak with the officer in charge of the detention of Senior Chief Darnell Sutton. She transferred the call to Hargrove. He picked up the receiver in his office, leaned back in his chair, and said, "Sheriff Hargrove?" What he heard next straightened his spine. The voice on the other end identified themselves as a representative from the Pentagon's Office of General Counsel. The tone was not a request. It was a notification. And for the first time that morning, the confidence in Dwight Hargrove's face cracked. While Sutton sat in a holding cell staring at a concrete wall, two things happened simultaneously that he knew nothing about. The first began behind the counter of the gas station off Highway 9. Colleen Fitch, the 23-year-old attendant who had watched the entire encounter through the store window, sat in the back office during her break and opened her phone. She had recorded 4 minutes and 11 seconds of footage, starting from the moment Skaggs pulled the dress blues out of the garment bag. The video showed the uniform held up like a costume. It showed two officers laughing. It showed a man in handcuffs being shoved headfirst into a cruiser. She uploaded it to 3 platforms with a single caption. "Sheriff just arrested a black man for driving his own car. He's military." Within the first hour, the video had 12,000 views. By the second hour, it had crossed 40,000. Comments flooded in. Shares multiplied, local activist pages picked it up. A civil rights attorney in Atlanta reposted it with the words, "This is Coulter County. This is what they do." The second thing happened 30 miles north at a truck stop off Interstate 16. Earl Jessup, the long-haul driver who had been parked at the gas station that morning eating a biscuit sandwich, saw the video on his phone while scrolling during a fuel stop. He recognized the gas station immediately. Then he recognized the Tahoe. Then he remembered his dash cam. He pulled the footage from the device and watched it. His camera had captured the entire encounter from a wider angle, the cruiser blocking the Tahoe in, the circling, the pat-down, the search, the cuffs, the shove, all of it from a clean, unobstructed vantage point. Jessup called the local news station in Savannah. He told them what he had. They told him not to delete anything and sent a crew to meet him within the hour. By early afternoon, the Coulter County Sheriff's Office was receiving media inquiries from outlets it had never heard of, asking questions it had no answers for. And Dwight Hargrove, sitting behind his desk with a phone that wouldn't stop ringing, was beginning to realize that the quiet arrest he had made at pump number 3 was no longer quiet. Hargrove closed his office door and told Skaggs to sit down. "The video is online," he said. Skaggs had already seen it. His face was pale. Hargrove pulled up the arrest report on his computer and stared at it. The line about Sutton attempting to flee stood out now like a lit fuse. "We need to clean this up," Hargrove said. He began editing the document, softening the language, removing the claim about furtive movements, replacing verbally combative with initially uncooperative. Skaggs watched but said nothing. He didn't object. He didn't question it. He sat in the same silence he had maintained at the gas station and let Hargrove rewrite the record. When the revised version was saved, Hargrove picked up the phone and called the county attorney, Vernon Poole. He explained the situation in broad terms, downplaying the force, omitting the cut on Sutton's forehead, framing the video as misleading and out of context. Poole listened, then asked one question. "Is the vehicle stolen?" Hargrove paused. "No." "Release him," Poole said. "Right now. No further statements, no press comments, nothing. Just let him go." Hargrove pushed back. "If we release him now, it looks like we were wrong. If you hold him any longer," Poole said, his voice flat, "this becomes federal. It may already be." Hargrove hung up. He sat for a long moment, jaw working, fingers drumming the desk. Then he made one more call. He ordered the Tahoe towed from the station impound lot to a secondary facility 30 miles south in Jessup. When Sutton was finally brought out of the holding cell, Hargrove handed him a clear plastic bag containing his wallet, phone, and watch. His military ID and leave papers were inside a separate envelope. No apology, no explanation. Hargrove told him the charges were being reviewed and that his vehicle would be available for retrieval once the investigation concluded. Sutton asked where the vehicle was. Hargrove said, "Jessup, 30 miles south. You can pick it up when we're done." Sutton stood on the front steps of the Coulter County Sheriff's Office at 4:17 in the afternoon. No vehicle, no ride. A cut above his eyebrow held together by dried blood. A town he'd never been to, and no reason to trust a single person in it. He put his hands in his pockets and started walking. The next morning, 3 black SUVs pulled into the parking lot of the Coulter County Sheriff's Office. The men and women who stepped out wore no uniforms, but their credentials spoke louder than any badge in the building. 2 NCIS special agents, a Department of Defense civil rights investigator, a representative from the FBI's Civil Rights Division. They walked through the front door at 8:06 a.m. and asked to speak with Sheriff Dwight Hargrove. Pam Gunther, the desk sergeant, stared at the federal IDs laid across her counter and picked up the phone without a word. Within the first hour, the investigators had secured the gas station's exterior security footage, both angles, full resolution, time-stamped. They had Earl Jessup's dashcam footage, already preserved by the Savannah news station that had copied it the day before. They had Colleen Fitch's phone video, downloaded directly from her device with her full cooperation. And then they found what Hargrove had hoped no one would look for: 2 versions of the arrest report. The original, filed at 1:42 p.m. the previous day, claiming Sutton was evasive, uncooperative, and attempted to flee, and the amended version, saved at 3:58 p.m. just hours later, with the language softened and the fleeing claim removed. The metadata was intact. The timestamps were undeniable. An NCIS agent placed both versions side by side on Hargrove's own desk and said, "You want to explain why there are 2 of these?" Hargrove called for his attorney. The interviews that followed took the rest of the day. Colleen Fitch described what she saw from behind the counter: the stop, the search, the laughter, the uniform held up like a prop. Earl Jessup described the cruiser pulling in at an angle, blocking the Tahoe before a single word had been spoken. 2 motorists who had slowed on Highway 9 gave statements describing Sutton in cuffs, compliant and still, while Hargrove shoved him into the cruiser. 3 customers inside the gas station described hearing the exchange through the open door. Every account matched. Sutton was calm. Sutton was cooperative. Sutton never raised his voice, never resisted, never moved without being told to. The sheriff was aggressive. The sheriff was mocking. The deputy followed without question, and the 2 reports sitting on the desk confirmed what the footage already proved: that Hargrove hadn't just arrested an innocent man, he had tried to bury it afterward. The federal investigation did not stop at the gas station. It went deeper. Investigators subpoenaed 5 years of arrest records from the Coulter County Sheriff's Office. Every traffic stop, every detention, every use of force report filed under Hargrove's authority. The data analysts who reviewed the numbers didn't need long to see the pattern. It was staggering. 74% of all traffic stops personally initiated by Hargrove involved Black or Latino drivers, in a county that was 68% white. The numbers alone would have been damning, but the paper trail made it worse. Investigators pulled complaint files from storage rooms and filing cabinets in the basement of the sheriff's office. Some were in folders so old the edges had yellowed. 8 prior allegations of excessive force. 11 formal complaints of racial profiling. Every single one had been reviewed and dismissed internally, and every single one had been dismissed by Hargrove himself. As elected sheriff, he oversaw his own disciplinary process. He was the complaint department. He was the review board. He was the final word. And his final word, in every case, was that nothing had happened. Then the witnesses came forward. 3 former deputies, all of whom had left the department within the past 4 years, contacted federal investigators through an anonymous tip line. Their accounts painted a picture of a department rotting from the top. Racial slurs were common in the break room and on ride-alongs. Hargrove referred to certain neighborhoods in the county using terms no official should ever speak aloud. Deputies who pushed back or refused to participate in targeted stops were quietly reassigned to overnight shifts, denied promotions, or pressured until they resigned. One of the 3 former deputies provided something the investigators hadn't expected: a recording. It was audio from a department barbecue 2 summers earlier, captured on a phone that had been left recording on a picnic table. In the recording, Hargrove could be heard telling a joke to a circle of deputies. The joke was about a black man driving a nice car and getting pulled over for stealing it. The punchline got laughs. It was the exact scenario he had manufactured against Darnell Sutton at pump number 3. When federal investigators played that recording in a closed briefing room, no one in the room said a word. They didn't need to. The pattern wasn't just visible. It was documented, repeated, and systemic. And it had been protected for over a decade by the one man who was supposed to prevent it. A federal grand jury convened in the Southern District of Georgia. The proceedings lasted 2 days. The evidence was presented methodically. The gas station footage, the dash cam footage, Colleen Fitch's phone video, the original arrest report and the amended version with its damning metadata, the 5 years of stop data, the buried complaints, the former deputy's testimony, the barbecue recording. On the second day, the grand jury returned indictments. Sheriff Dwight Hargrove was charged with deprivation of rights under color of law under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, conspiracy to obstruct justice for the falsified and amended arrest reports, and filing false statements in connection with a federal investigation. Deputy Ronnie Skaggs was indicted as a co-conspirator and charged with accessory to civil rights violations. He had followed every order. He had laughed at every joke. He had stood by while an innocent man was searched, cuffed, cut, and caged. The law had a name for that kind of silence. County Attorney Vernon Poole was investigated for his role in advising Hargrove during the hours between the arrest and the release. Prosecutors examined whether his instruction to release Sutton was damage control or genuine legal counsel. Poole cooperated fully, turned over phone records and emails, and provided a detailed timeline of his communications with Hargrove that afternoon. He avoided indictment, but his reputation in Coulter County would never fully recover. Hargrove posted bail and was suspended from duty pending trial. The governor's office issued a statement confirming that an interim sheriff would be appointed. 2 days later, Hargrove stood behind a podium outside the county courthouse and gave a press conference. His voice was steady, but his eyes were hard. He called the indictment a federal witch hunt driven by media pressure and political agendas. He said he had served Coulter County faithfully for 26 years and that he would be vindicated. The clip was picked up by national outlets within the hour. It went viral, but not in his favor. The comment sections filled with links to the gas station footage, screenshots of the arrest data, and quotes from the barbecue recording. Hargrove had spent 26 years controlling the narrative in Coulter County. He could not control this one. The federal trial began on a Monday morning in the Southern District of Georgia. It lasted 2.5 weeks. On the first day, prosecutors played all 3 video sources synchronized on split screens: gas station security, Earl Jessup's dashcam, Colleen Fitch's phone footage. The jury watched from 3 angles as Sutton complied with every command, while Hargrove circled, mocked, searched, and fabricated. They heard the surplus store comment. They heard Skaggs laugh. They watched Hargrove shove Sutton's head into the doorframe and saw the cut open above his eyebrow. Sutton testified on the 4th day with the precision of someone trained to deliver after-action reports. Every word, every gesture, every minute on that concrete bench. When asked why he didn't resist, he paused. because I know what happens to a black man who resists, even when he's right, especially when he's right. 3 former deputies described a department culture built on slurs and selective enforcement. A statistical expert presented the arrest data. 74% of Hargrove stops targeted black or Latino drivers in a county that was 68% white. Hargrove's defense claimed he acted on a legitimate stolen vehicle report. Prosecutors proved no such report existed in any database. The jury deliberated 5 hours. Guilty on all counts. Hargrove received 6 years. Skaggs received 2. Neither man apologized. The civil lawsuit followed. Sutton filed against Coulter County, Hargrove, and Skaggs, citing unlawful detention, excessive force, racial profiling, fabrication of evidence, and deliberate indifference. Discovery unearthed internal emails between county officials calling Hargrove's behavior a known issue, but noting he delivers results, and the voters like him. The county settled for $4.2 million and entered a federal consent decree mandating independent oversight, mandatory bias training, body cameras, a civilian review board, and demographic reporting on all stops and arrests. Hargrove's name was removed from the department's wall of honor. His portrait was taken down from the courthouse lobby. No ceremony, no announcement. Just an empty hook on the wall and a faint